This is Truth Be Told.
That not only are there reptilians here,
new evidence of UFO fleets.
We were close to nuclear war.
To help you transform so that you can live your highest truth.
We're not being told just because we're not ready for it.
Radio stations of frequency, vibrational.
I was a homicide detective with LAPD.
UFOs increase. Visitations. In 1621, when Plymouth survival was hanging by the balance, the Wampanoag tribe and the Plymouth governor declared their friendship for each other and commitment to mutual defense. And this is the beginning of the first Thanksgiving. But today we're going to talk with Professor David J. Silverman, who is a professor at George Washington University, where he specializes in Native American, Colonial American, and American racial history. His book, This Land is Their Land, the Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving. It's good to know the truth about where we began and where others ended. So sit back, get your questions ready, and let's talk with Professor Silverman. I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, Professor David Silverman. All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks for having me.
I am excited to have you here, and I'm sure everybody else is too. As you know, 2 weeks away is Thanksgiving, and we're going to be talking about your book. And first of all, you have 5 books, and I'm sure a lot of them are to do with American history or Native American history. And as we talk about, ghosts and UFOs and all these things, there's always something that has intrigued us to kind of go on this journey of the path that we choose for as a career or a hobby or something. So, first of all, how did you fall into this study of American colonial history and American Native American history?
I think, like a lot of historians and students of history, I had a father who was an inveterate plaque reader whenever we went on family trips.
Okay.
It's a particularly historically minded place, surrounded by sites and a historical consciousness. I think that was a great part of it. I had terrific history teachers growing up. Undoubtedly, that was an influence here, and that was true in grade school and secondary school, and especially in college. And once I got to college, I decided I really didn't ever want to leave. So this was kind of my way of making that happen.
Yeah, and I grew up in Kansas, in southeast Kansas, and not even realizing most of the towns and counties around me were named after Native American tribes. Chautauqua, Wichita. We just thought that was just name of the town, but that was Wichita tribe. There's so many different tribes that were in America at that before the white man arrived, that we didn't even know him back. I'm sure you've heard about the discovery of the, I'm not for sure of the tribe itself, but a city by Arkansas City, Kansas, that they say there was at least 20,000 people that inhabited this town or city at one time. And I was like, that's like 45 miles from my home. And so we've always portrayed them in history as savage, little teepees here and there, but there were major cities already developed, with democracies and all kinds of tribal councils and all kinds of different things. So, yeah, it's amazing when we go back in history with people like yourself that have done the work to bring us a lot of the truth about what was before us.
Oh, absolutely. And, the point that you make is actually critical to the book that we're discussing today, because, one of the points that I emphasize in it is we need to do away with a lot of the ideological baggage that we bring to our understanding of the first Thanksgiving, as it were. Yeah. And among that ideological baggage is the notion that the Pilgrims, the English, arrived in a new world or wilderness. And, it was nothing of the sort. It was an old world filled with human civilizations.
Right.
And it's not an untouched wilderness. It's a place that's crisscrossed by, pathways and towns, and, other marks of human activity on the land.
Yeah.
To call it a new world or a wilderness is to set you up to excuse the death and dispossession of the first people.
And it may been a new world to the colonial people from England and wherever else they came from, but like you said, this it's thousands of years before, probably tens of thousands of years before we even arrived. So, well, this land is their land. I love the title, because it does the song "This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land." I love that you brought that into it. And when you start putting books together like this, where do you start with your research? Especially, a very popular holiday, Thanksgiving. There's we forget about what really had to take place to get that holiday embedded into our history.
Right. Well, that's a product of a lot of ideological conditioning that began quite a long time ago, which I'm happy to unpack for you. In terms of why I wrote the book, there are a couple of different factors here. The main one is that back when I started my career as a historian, I was writing a book about the Wampanoag people of Martha's Vineyard, and there's a federally recognized tribe with a reservation out on that small island, and I found that their survival deeply curious. I wanted to know, how did they manage to accomplish that? It's a rare feat in New England. And in the course of doing that work, I reached out to the tribe and started to get to know a number of the people there. And what kept coming up repeatedly in our conversations was how difficult the Thanksgiving season was for them, and how doubly difficult it was for their kids in school. And the reason it was so hard is that here they are struggling to remain in their homelands. And when they leave their reservation, what do they see? I mean, to them, what they see is a desecration of a sacred space to them. And they wonder all the time, what was all our suffering for? This sprawl
right
all around us, right? These vacation estates for the elite. And yet, when it came to Thanksgiving season, it seemed that American society, their society, let's be clear, they are our countrymen and women, was at best making light of a trauma, a historical trauma that we're increasingly coming to understand as a genocide. At worst, it seemed that Americans were celebrating it. And for the kids in school, they had authority figures who were supposed to know better, right? Who were supposed to know the history propagating these lies. I mean, they're really profound untruths. And almost invariably, the Wampanoags kept telling me, those lessons would be followed up by the teacher saying that the New England Indians were all gone, even as they were sitting directly in front of them. And the reason, of course, is because we do such a poor job as a society of teaching Native American history that most Americans don't know how to see modern indigenous people for what they are, which is like modern members of our society. So that stuck with me. The other impetus for the book was that I participate in these teacher training institutes every summer at Mount Vernon, George Washington's historic estate. And the teachers are flown in. These are high school teachers mostly. And my job is to help them bone up on their revolutionary American history. But then I always say to them, I am a specialist in Native American history. Ask me anything you want. And a disproportionate number of the questions aren't about George Washington and Native America or revolutionary this or that. they were about Thanksgiving. And the reason is that's the one cameo that indigenous people make in the history curricula of these teachers. And the teachers, you know, they were very upfront about this. They knew next to nothing about Native American history. And so they wanted me to help them teach these lessons better. Right. It seemed to me that it was high time for a book on this subject.
Well, let's do a little time travel. Let's go back to 1621. Yeah. So kind of take us through the beginning, because it sounds like, you know, the Plymouth and the local tribe started off, it sounded like on a good relationship. Can you kind of take us through that history? Because was that the case, or was that just something that was made up after the fact?
It's good only on a sliding scale. And it's good only if you isolate. Let's be clear. There was a shared feast. Mm-hmm. That is true. Holding up that feast as a symbol of Native colonial relations is rather missing the point. And it's a deliberate missing of the point. It's an attempt to sanitize a bloody and really deeply disturbing history.
Right.
So, you know, let's look at what happened before the feast, and
Please,
let's look at what happened after the feast. So I imagine that most of your viewers imagine that the arrival of the Mayflower is a first contact episode.
Right.
Right. It's not. The Wampanoags, who inhabited what's now southeastern Massachusetts, had been in contact with Europeans since at least 1524.
Oh, wow.
15. So we're talking about 100 years. And those contacts had become increasingly frequent from 1602 onward. I'm talking about 2 or 3 contacts a year. Those contacts almost invariably were bloody. Usually what happens is you have this exploring ship, and you know, it's trying to chart the coast and determine what resources are available there. Sometimes these vessels would anchor off the coast and make contact with the local people and inaugurate a trade. And almost invariably that trade went wrong. You know, sometimes it's because one party or another felt threatened by the other. Sometimes it's because one party or another stole something from the other, and the two come to blows. What's more, a disproportionate number of these exploring ventures engage in slave taking, which is to say that Europeans of various nations would kidnap Native people and then bring them back across the Atlantic to sell into bondage.
Wow.
And I mean, this is happening regularly. And one of the most famous cases of this sort involves the figure Squanto, who will later become an interpreter between Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoags. He's taken several years before the arrival of the Mayflower, along with 25 other Wampanoags, and sold into slavery in Spain.
Wow.
Well, only through sheer luck, he manages to go free, fall into contact with an English merchant community, ends up in London, travels back and forth between England and Newfoundland, and eventually, just 6 months before the arrival of the Mayflower, winds up back in New England. And so, you know, he's in a position to tell the Wampanoags what he's seen in Europe. Point is, it's no first contact episode. These people are pretty well versed in who these folks are. They know that they're violent. They know that they're treacherous, but they also know that they have incredible technology, swords, hatchets, muskets, and the like, which will give them an advantage in intertribal relations, which is a primary concern of theirs. We also need to look at what happens after dessert is served and the plates are cleared at that so-called first Thanksgiving. And what happens is colonization, right? And colonization is all about dispossessing indigenous people for the benefit of Europeans and subjugating. And the relationship that's forged at that Thanksgiving meal goes to hell in a handbasket. I mean, really within the course of a generation. And there's near constant war scares between the two peoples. And eventually in 1675, it culminates in a regional war that ultimately breaks the back of Indian power in the region.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, as somebody that has a family that has been in this country a long time too, you know, not nearly as long. And I told you before, you know, Richard Stockton was one of my ancestors, and, you know, some of my family have been back 1600s. I don't know about 1500s, but definitely some into the 1600s. And a lot of people have a hard time, and I don't understand believing or wanting to believe that we could do wrong. We could not treat the Native Americans with respect and I'm looking at him smile, but are giving them their, you know, kudos for already establishing for thousands of years in America. And not off topic, but why do you think as Americans, white Americans, we have such a hard time believing this truth about ourselves?
Well, think back to every presidential debate that you've witnessed in your adult life. At some point in the election cycle, some dim-witted reporter is going to pose to both presidential candidates the profound question, do you think the United States is the greatest country in the world? And of course, there's only one right answer in that context. Right, they have to say, well, yes, it's the greatest country in the world. Well, you know, of course, you know, the real adult answer is, well, it's great in some ways and not so great in other ways. You know, there's room for improvement here, and you know, I'm pretty happy with where it is there. But you know, that kind of nuance is not the sort of thing that political campaigns are about.
Right.
Most people, and I don't mean just in the United States, I don't mean just white people in the United States, I mean most people across space and time have believed that the purpose of a history education is to cultivate patriotism for, pick your group, the tribe, the nation, the whatever group it is that you belong to. That is not what professional historians do, and that's why we make people mad so often. What we do is we try to capture a complex history in all of its complexity, regardless of who that upsets. And the fact of the matter is this: all of our ancestors will disappoint us if we look closely enough.
True.
Our ancestors didn't share the same morals as we did.
Right.
And even if they did, it's hard for human beings usually to live up to their own moral standards. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, history is full of bloodshed and ruthlessness and exploitation. And if you want to see that package all together, look at the history of Europeans and Native Americans. You know, because the fact of the matter is this: you know, this was a continent full of tens of millions of indigenous people who lived, as we discussed, in civilizations. And Europeans took it all from them. And that was not a voluntary process on the part of Native America. It was a deeply violent process. No wonder the descendants of the people who propagated that evil don't want to look at square in the face. It's hard to live with. Yeah. But look, Native people today are our countrymen and women. They didn't come to that point willingly,
right? But
they are. And they deserve, just as assuredly as the rest of us deserve, to see that and hear that history in all of its disturbing details. We all stand to learn from it.
Yeah, I'm all about, that's when I think I really love history. Because doing my own family history for almost 30 years, actually longer than that, there were some people that I was very proud to say that they're my ancestors, and there's a few that I'm like, I'm not as, yes, I'm not as, because, we forget that, we have 2 parents and then 4 grandparents, 8, 16, and it just keeps growing, and you have a lot of descendants, or you're descendant from a lot of people. So not everybody is going to be good people. Not everybody's going to be people you can be proud of. Right. But by acknowledging the mistakes that they made, sometimes you might be able to, as an individual, change somebody else's life or somebody else's status in society just by being able to help them in return for, not saying it's never going to make up for what your ancestors did, but it can, make you a better person, I believe. That's what history's all about.
And, what's more, it will help us to understand how our country, the way our country is.
Right.
It will help us to understand, look, I always say to my students, I'm in Washington, D.C. I always say to them, where's the nearest Indian reservation? In the hall.
They're like, what?
I have no idea. And I'll say, okay, well, the next time we meet, I want you to tell me where the nearest one is. And what they'll say is, well, quite a distance away. And I'll say, okay, we're going to discuss how it got that way.
Right.
Right. This isn't a natural process. This is a product of human beings making decisions.
Right. Yeah. Growing up in Kansas, definitely, we're like 20 miles from the Oklahoma border. There were lots of Indian reservations. A lot of Cherokee because, the Trail of Tears and all, we learned about that. And again, we don't really think about it, but I always tell people, imagine being settled in, your family has, 1,000 years of owning or being part of the land, and people just come in and just completely saying, you're out, go another 600 miles or 1,200 miles away, and that's your new, and it's complete different terrain. There's, you don't know the land, and so, it makes a big difference when you start really putting yourselves in their shoes or moccasins or whatever they wore back then.
You bet. I mean, look, Kansas, where you came from, also used to have a lot of Indian reservations.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was part of federal Indian territory.
Yeah, it doesn't have as many as it used to.
No, it does not, because Bleeding Kansas drove most of the native people south into Oklahoma. Yeah. And that's also a story that's buried in American history. Everyone knows Bleeding Kansas, but they don't know how, both the pro and anti-slavery forces bled that place white. Is really how it went. Yeah. We all stand to learn something profound about where we live, about our own identities. Mm-hmm. The racial identity white was defined not just in the context of enslaving Africans, but in the context of Native American relations. We need to understand the reservation system, which is part of our society, and hardly any, even well-educated people, know nothing about it.
Right.
They don't know nothing. How do reservations work? What's the status of Native people in our society? We ignore it as a society altogether, and I think the main reason is the one you alluded to. It's such difficult history that most non-Native people prefer to avoid it altogether.
And I think a lot of people forget, or may not even forget, maybe just have never known that the Iroquois, a lot of their framework was adopted into our own, like national symbol for the bald eagle, and just there's a lot of, I might be wrong, but and there's other Native American traditions that was it the Constitution or the.
I take issue with that line of interpretation, but it is a common one. The big point is Native people have not been the least bit peripheral to the development of American society. I mean, they've been fundamental to it from the very beginning. Even when we get into the 20th century, where their numbers are seriously diminished and their landholdings are minor. Look, the first 20 years of Hollywood, most of the movies were about Native people. It was just remarkable. They have always been a presence in American society, influencing a whole range of critical issues.
In your book, you did talk in just in history. And sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the chief's name.
Massasoit is his title. Just like Joe Biden is Mr. President.
Right.
His proper name is Usamiquin. In English, that means yellow feather.
When they signed the treaty with the colonial governor, Plymouth's governor, how long did that last, and what was it that really started falling apart? Was it because when there's good rain and there's good crops and everything's going good, there's enough food for everyone, and then of course as everywhere you get droughts, things go wrong and scarce, and everything. So where did things go wrong? When did it start to happen? Because they seemed like they were in good terms for a while.
Right. Well, in some ways it goes wrong from even before the Mayflower arrives. Here's why I say, the condition for the Wampanoags to permit the English to form Plymouth Colony, derived from an epidemic disease between 1616 and 1619, inadvertently introduced by one of these exploring ships, that decimates their population. It sends them into population freefall, whereupon their Narragansett rivals to the west begin subjugating to the status of tribute payers. So they're reaching out to the English in the hopes of setting up a military and trade alliance that will enable them to fend off the Narragansetts. In the short term, that's a good plan. And, again, that's what this treaty is all about. It does work for the Wampanoags. They maintain their independence from the Narragansetts. They load up on, metaphorically and literally, on English guns and other weaponry. And they reconsolidate their society in the wake of this epidemic. And it's a mutually beneficial relationship. But where it really starts to go south is as early as 1629. That is with the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the north of Plymouth. Right. Plymouth is always a nothing place. There's only 100 passengers on the Mayflower. And for the rest of its history, Plymouth is underpopulated. It's economically marginal. It's a forgettable colony. Massachusetts is not. Massachusetts begins with a migration of 15,000 people in the course of just 10 years. And so, 15,000, just to put that in perspective, is about the size of a large tribe in southern New England. So the Narragansetts, for instance, would have been about 15,000 people. So it's as if a whole new major tribe arrived. But that major tribe starts reproducing like rabbits right away. The women in that great migration between 1629 and 1640 are on average bearing 8 children over the course of their lives. It's a recipe for a population explosion.
Right.
What's more, they come not just with people, they come with cows, horses, sheep, pigs, which number, they're much greater in number than the human beings, and they start overrunning the land. So that process, combined with the ongoing cycle of epidemic diseases, which is cutting through Indian country, means that by the time we get to the mid 17th century, so like 1650, the English are becoming a population majority, and they're really starting to throw their weight around, which is to say they're driving native people off the land. They're trying to assert their jurisdiction over them. They're engaging in divide and conquer tactics against native tribes. And by the time we get to the 1670s, the son of Usamiquin, or Massasoit, his name is Pametacom. We know him as King Philip. He decides, my father's decision to ally with these people was a terrible mistake. It gave these folks a foothold to dispossess us. And if we allow this process to continue, we're going to end up landless. We're going to end up enslaved. We're going to end up subjugated. And he's 100% right about that. And so in 1675, he leads his people and a multi-tribal coalition to war against the New England colonies.
And how many people was estimated part of the King Philip's War on the Native American side?
It's impossible to say. So this is not, King Philip's War is not purely an Indian colonial war. And yeah, I should note just contextually, there are very few pure Indian colonial wars. Almost all wars that we characterize that way actually involve coalitions of tribes against another coalition of colonies and tribes.
Right.
So there are Native people on both sides of this contest. In New England, the groups of people that fight against the English include Wampanoags from the mainland, which is to say not including Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket,
right?
But mainland Wampanoags, Narragansetts. So the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts healed their rivalry and ally against the English. Nipmucks and various Abnaki groups. On the other side are Christian Wampanoags from Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard. Wow. They fight on the side of the English.
Oh, they do. Okay.
Indians, and Pequots. And eventually the Mohawks also join in on the English side. And so, this is a multilateral war with lots of different, the chessboard is crowded and moving.
I'm curious. I mean, like you said, being that far back and not, we didn't have census takers and we didn't have, well, we probably had historians, but not a lot of people taking notes. A lot of people couldn't even probably read and write at the time.
Right.
But how was from your knowledge, before the colonization of, a lot of the white, how was the Native Americans before we arrived? Because, they weren't all friendly to each other. No. So do you know, before we arrived, were they a lot of battles and wars before we arrived here ourselves?
So there are two stereotypes of Native people that aren't very helpful for understanding their history before the arrival of Europeans or after.
Right.
One, and this is an older view, is that they were bloodthirsty savages, right? Like no,
that's what we're known for.
Impact in the world than wolves roaming the woods. The other, and this is a much more recent notion, although it does have a long lineage, is that they're proto-hippies and proto-environmentalists and at one with the universe and with each other, and that they're stewards of the land and peaceniks and proto-feminists. Neither view allows people to see them in three-dimensional form, which is to say they act pretty much like human beings everywhere else around the world, which is, sometimes they act nobly and sometimes they act ignobly. Sometimes they treat the land in a sustainable way and sometimes they overexploit it. Sure, they go to war with each other just like everyone else on the face of the globe.
Everybody else, yeah.
They murder each other, they enslave each other, they exploit each other, they treat each other with respect and tenderly. The whole range of human behaviors.
I just always think, even like the Lone Ranger, how they when they say "Tonto, my gun," it's like and we don't realize that, it's, what does it mean? Stupid or something like that. Tonto in Spanish or something or idiot.
He speaks in grunts.
Yeah. And so it's the portrayal is just crazy to me. So I want to touch on the Thanksgiving part of it. And I think it was in 1870, I think, is when Thanksgiving, President Grant in 1870 officially made Thanksgiving a holiday. Again, nowadays we still get together and we've kind of made it commercial like everything else we do. But again, we forgot about, for me, even the beginning of where this all comes from. So if we can't even get away from the commercial side of it and think about being thankful for, how it all began, how are we even going to think about what really happened to being able to even create this holiday? What is your take on Thanksgiving? How do you celebrate? And should we do like Columbus Day of, say, an Indigenous Day, or how do we make things right when we celebrate holidays like this, when it really was a genocide and it really was not necessarily a good event that took place?
Well, let me be clear about what I'm doing in this book, which is not what I've been charged of doing by reactionaries who don't want us to have critical conversations about history.
Right.
I am not suggesting that you shouldn't get together with your family and enjoy your time together,
right,
and reflect on what's good in your lives and be grateful for it. Hell, we should be doing that more often, right?
More often, yes.
I limit it to once a year. It's a wonderful ritual, and let me note, more than a few Native people do the same, right?
Yeah.
I should also point out they were doing that long before 1621, as were the English. What I am suggesting is, if we're going to associate the holiday with Pilgrims and Indians, and I don't think we have to at all, get the story straight. I don't propagate a false history that sanitizes a real trauma for our Indigenous countrymen and women, and that blinds the rest of us to the inequities that are part and parcel of our society. Now, let me be clear about something. You mentioned, it's not until the Civil War era that Thanksgiving becomes a national holiday. Lincoln declares it, Grant declares it, on we go. White New Englanders were celebrating Thanksgivings throughout the 17th century, throughout the 18th century, and into the 19th century, and they never invoked Pilgrims and Indians. They did not associate this holiday with that story.
Oh, they didn't.
That is an invention of the 1800s.
Wow.
And so if you want to hold a traditional Thanksgiving, don't mention Pilgrims and Indians. There's a much longer history of holding Thanksgivings without those associations than with them.
Wow. See, if I knew that, I forgot it.
Yeah, right. So, what happens, there's a number of different factors that lead to this association. One is that in the early 19th century, the two primary source accounts of the 1621 feast are finally published. Before there'd only been a manuscript form and very few people had read them. And in one of the primary source accounts, by the way, we're really only talking about a small paragraph.
Right.
These don't go on and on and on, because none of the contemporaries thought that this was an important event. But, there's one edition that's published, and the editor included a footnote. And the footnote read something like this. He said, "This was the first Thanksgiving, the Great Harvest Festival of New England." Now, look, I'm a historian. I read tons of footnotes, but most people pay no attention to footnotes. This is like one of the only famous footnotes in history. It actually introduces the idea to the public that this harvest festival and shared dinner with Wampanoags and colonists in 1621 was the precedent for the Thanksgiving holiday. But up to that point, it's really just a Yankee holiday, just in the Northeast. So, how does it become a national holiday? Well, for one, Lincoln declares it at a time when the South had seceded. And so,
Right.
it's just Yankees left. They're really open to it being a national holiday. And it takes a while for the South to pick up on the holiday and put their own stamp on it. The association with Pilgrims and Indians begins to take off around that time for a couple of different reasons. One is that the country then, as now, had a great deal of anxiety over immigrants, except then the immigrants were Catholics from Ireland and Germany. And, the old Protestant stock liked the Pilgrim and Indian story because it granted cultural authority to their ancestors as colonial founding fathers, because the Pilgrims are supposed to introduce, religious liberty and democracy to the United States. It's a time when, particularly once we get to the 1880s, the Indian Wars of the West are drawing to a close, and the country can finally incorporate Native people as some kind of unthreatening symbol rather than characterizing them as, bloodthirsty savages. And then finally, this becomes a way to integrate immigrants from abroad into the cultural values that old stock Americans want them to absorb. It's a story about bloodless colonialism and the introduction of religious liberty and democracy. And it allows those immigrants to, I think we should think about this hard. People like me, my name's Silverman. I don't come from colonists. But the Thanksgiving myth teaches people like me to identify with the Pilgrims as we, not with the natives, but with the Pilgrims as we. It's a way of inculcating newcomers with white identity. And let's be clear, I don't descend from either group, and the descendants of both groups are my fellow Americans. But it is creating a sense of racial identification and while at the same time marginalizing indigenous people, which is part of what the country's all about.
No, I love what you said on that, and I'm curious on, like you said, a lot of Native Americans consider this a day of mourning. That's and right. I've never, like I said, we're too busy wrapped up in our holiday. I know they consider a day of mourning. So have you ever been to maybe I don't even know what they would do on a day of mourning such as this? Do they prayer?
That tradition begins in 1970. So it's the 350th anniversary of the founding of Plymouth, and Massachusetts is all in a froth about this, trying to drum up tourism and patriotism. Right. And a Wampanoag activist and music teacher named Frank James from the island of Martha's Vineyard originally, but he lived at Cape Cod at the time. He had been invited to speak at a banquet in Boston on this 350th anniversary. And when he submitted his speech for review, it was rejected by the organizers. They said this is too inflammatory. And he said, that's the speech. They came to loggerheads. He pulled out of it and said, you know what? Screw this. I'm gonna make something of this moment. And so he organized what he called, he had been part of intertribal activist circles for a long time. So he organizes what he calls a National Day of Mourning to take place at the Massasoit statue on a hill in Plymouth town overlooking Plymouth Rock.
Oh, wow.
And Native people come from all over to come to this protest. And, they give speeches denouncing the evils of colonialism. And, Frank James puts the Thanksgiving story in a much darker light than most of the public was accustomed to hearing. And it became an annual tradition. And so, there is a National Day of Mourning protest every year in Plymouth town by Native people. And they now come from not only all over New England, but all over the country and sometimes all over the hemisphere. I mean, there are Native people from South America and Central America and Canada. When I have talked to Wampanoag people about how they spend Thanksgiving, one of them said to me, ask 10 Wampanoags, you get 10 different answers. Some say, I'm not going to celebrate my own people's demise.
Right.
I'm going to mourn on that day. Others go to the day of mourning protest and then go home in the afternoon and have a turkey, with their family. Others just have a traditional Thanksgiving as we understand it to be. So, Native America is a diverse place. And, again, ask 10 people, you get 10 different answers.
Well, I love this. And, unfortunately, our time is running out. And I really appreciate you putting together the work for this and giving us something to think about. And like you said, critical thinking, I think, is important for just having discussions. And I think a lot of people may come in with a different perspective and a different way of thinking, which is fine. And I think that's what, how people can heal and how people can grow. And I'm curious, my last question here.
Yeah.
In your classes, how do students react to some of the true history that is being taught? Because I know this is a big kind of a up in the air about teaching kids history about certain things. Yeah. How is the students reacting to some of these truths?
They feel lied to for having not been taught any of it until they've gotten to college, and they have been lied to. And, I'm not accusing their high school instructors of deliberately sanitizing the past, because I think very few of those instructors know the history to begin with. But our society has worked very hard for a very long time to bury this history, because it does not want to confront its uncomfortable truths and the implications for now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I share this history with the students, they recognize the way that so much of history education is driven by ideology. And ideology, the opponents of this kind of history say, well, by teaching this history, you have an ideological agenda to tear down the country.
Right.
I don't want to tear down the country. I love this country. This
same
country
here.
has given my family the opportunity
to
thrive in a way that it never could have. But the truth is the truth. And I always say, do you want your patriotism to be based on falsehoods, or do you want your patriotism to be based on truth? We're all grown-ups here. We can deal with the truth.
Right. No, I agree. No, and I think it's kind of an insult when, to me, when people act like I can't handle the truth, but but I can. I'm a Sagittarius, and if you look at the description of a Sagittarius, it says seeker of truth, and that's where Truth Be Told, my name of my show, for 13 years, almost 1,000 episodes, has come from. It's just it's not that I love America. I'm very proud. I would not want to live in any other country. I'm proud of a lot of my ancestors that have built and, fought in every single war that, Revolutionary, Civil War. I mean, pretty much every war my family has fought in, and I'm very honored to be a part of this history. But it is sometimes we have to hear the truth about that's not going to make us as proud, but just like you said, just learning from our mistakes and moving forward, and people like yourself putting these amazing books, This Land Is Their Land, together, and but thank you for doing that. And I know you have another book coming out soon, so we'll have to have you back for that one too. But where can people find this book? Where can they go?
Oh, yeah, it's available on Amazon. But if you're going to order it through your local independent bookstore.
Yeah.
They need your business.
Yeah, always. Don't let Tom Hanks take it. Do you remember the movie?
Yeah, right. Thanks for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and keep making us proud. And teachers and professors are the ones that make the next generation great. So, appreciate you being here. Thank you, Professor. Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. All right, everybody. Well, thank you guys so much for being part of Truth Be Told. It was a great honor to have Professor David Silverman on the show and talking about his book, This Land is Their Land. Please go out and support and pick up a copy and share it with your kids and grandkids and encourage, teach the truth about our history, which doesn't mean to make our country look bad. It's just, learning from our history is always the best way to go. So I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Please, next time, every Friday right here at 3 o'clock, don't miss it. And we'll see you real soon. Take care of each other and yourself. Bye. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media. Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio. Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.